also. So I'll share that with you before I move on to talking about the Advanced HE project. So what I want to speak to you obviously this afternoon is about race and racism, racial literacy around what we've decided in the project. But for me, most importantly, is the allyship, that developing an anti-racist consciousness to our work, to our practice within the university institution. So it really is important for us to be thinking about and having those conversations. The other aspect here is that I wanted to share with you my own journey. I, as I said, grew up in Scotland. I studied my BEd undergraduate teaching degree, so I'm a primary school teacher by trade. And for many years attending school where my own teachers couldn't pronounce my name correctly. I didn't see myself being reflected in the curriculum. In fact, I grew up reading stories around Jane and Tom, and never did I come across a story that talked about Aisha or Omar. So for me, it was an interesting experience. And then when I moved on to my teacher training at the university, again, my teacher education programme, although we spoke about teacher identity, I don't think it went far enough to encourage me to think about my personal and my professional identity and how the two are intimately linked. So I think for the majority of the time, I spent assimilating into the majority culture and how that impacted on my own teaching. I went on to teach in an all-white school. All the staff that I worked with were from a white ethnic background. All the young people that I was working with were also from a white ethnicity. And I carried on playing white, as I called it. The time that I think I had my big wake-up call was 9/11. 9/11 took place, and a few days later, we were back in school, and the young people in my class, at that point, actually, just to note here, I wasn't wearing my hijab, which is a visible marker of the faith that I follow. And the young people were saying, Mrs. Muhammad, did you see what the Muslims did? And we entered into a fascinating conversation around, this is terrible. They're not human. And I stopped them eventually, and I said, boys and girls, does my name give you a clue as to what faith I follow? And there was pin drop silence. And wee Jamie at the back shouts out, oh, you're a Muslim. And I said, yes, I am. And followed by very quickly, but you're different. You're not like them. And so again, we carried the conversation forward. So, okay, what makes me different? And what do you mean I'm not like them? Who are them? And, it was such a good discussion. It really was. It was a fantastic opportunity to try and dispel and disrupt any of the stereotypes that young people were picking up from the media, from their parents, from their peers in the school playground. And what transpired was the young people spoke about in Scotland, if you're a football fan, you'll be very aware that there's this Rangers and Celtic feud that goes on, sort of whole sectarianism debate. But there's also, they brought up the discussion of the IRA. And the young people left my classroom that afternoon, I think, and I'm absolutely certain that they would challenge anybody who would have made a negative comment about the Muslim community thereafter. And I think for me, that was my wake-up call to realise that there was other repertoires to my identity that impacted on the kind of teacher that I would go on to become. And then I moved into teaching at university as a teacher educator. And I researched into the experiences of Black and minority ethnic teachers in Scotland. And did they have similar experiences that I had experienced? But I went on to look at recruitment, retention and promotion of BAME staff across our education sector. And I think it was just that experience alone, and also the work that I do with my student teachers in Scotland. Our initial teacher education programmes are predominantly from a white female, so very homogenous group of students. BAME students are very much in the minority. We'll often have, depending on the institution, some of them will have maybe 4 or 5 My institution will be lucky if we have one or two. And so they're always in the minority. And so I used to work with my student teachers to say, how confident are you in navigating conversations around race? Would you be comfortable enough in dealing with a racist incident if it was to arise in your school or classroom? How would you challenge the status quo in terms of the curriculum? Are we reinforcing or minoritizing particular voices without realizing it? And so that led me into all those sorts of programs and working with my students. And then my research followed. So I became, actually in my own institution, the race person, as I call it. So I was the go-to person for people to say, oh, right, I want to find out more about Ramadan. Can you do help? And that's fine. Absolutely happy to support my colleagues, because I'm always working with the basis, you don't know what you don't know. However, a little bit of a caution here, it then does become quite burdensome. Yeah, you begin to be the person thinking, why is it always me that has to have those conversations or raise the question in a staff meeting, or sometimes putting yourself in a vulnerable position to ask that pressing question, but then thinking, I don't know if I should. Will it have implications on my own promotion or possible future trajectory at the academy? And so therefore I started to talk more about, is the team all right? When we have Senate, when we have executive meetings, our governance structures, do we have BAME representation there? And if we do, fantastic. But even if we do, we still need our white colleagues to be able to stand with us in that solidarity. So that's the allyship that comes to the fore. But before we even get to that stage, there needs to be this idea of an understanding of difference. And I say this because I've worked with the myth of sameness. I have had colleagues, I have had teachers who will say, Khadija, I treat all my students the same. Yeah, and that might have a really positive intention around, I don't want to be seen to be treating somebody differently. So, I treat them all the same. And I'm actually saying, well, no, that's not appropriate, because you have to acknowledge the difference. And once we acknowledge the difference, we begin to nurture the difference. And alongside that comes then the celebration of that diversity as well. But by saying that I'm the same as another white colleague actually is then giving me a message that knowing that I come from a cultural background doesn't feature in your discussions, that the colour of my skin doesn't have an impact. When it does, on a day-to-day basis, I have to navigate that. So I would like my educators to recognise that as well. So that's why I love this quote. When I do not know myself, I cannot know who my students are. And when I can't see them clearly, I cannot teach them well. So I'm always saying to my colleagues, get to know your students. And I know that sometimes we have large lecture theatres, and we have smaller tutorial groups, and sometimes we'll have numbers of groups. But at best, try to get to know them in a sense of, the diversity, the cognitive diversity that they bring, and think about, when we're working with them, the curriculum that we're presenting to them, how much does it relate to their lived experience? Do they have a sense of agency when they come onto our campuses to learn? And it brings me then back to this, that what we were saying in the Advanced HE project is that we need to have every member of staff, whether you are an academic member of staff, whether you are, one of our VPs, or you're a professional services member of staff, students alike, we need to have a really firm understanding, a nuanced understanding of what race and racism and whiteness is and how it manifests in our day-to-day. Because in our Advanced HE steering group, in response to the EHRC project, we decided from the very beginning, maybe something else to add to that was that the steering group for us, predominantly from a BME background, which has been fabulous because we bring that lived experience, and we worked from the very beginning to say this will not be a campaign, another race campaign that runs for a while and after it just dies a death. It has to have tangible change. It has to support our colleagues to move the conversation forward. So we need to get that training in. We need to begin to understand how it manifests. And in a book that I recently read, and I know we've talked about it a lot in our webinars, is Angela Saini's book Superior: The Return of Race Science. Fabulous book, and as Professor Arshad said in one of the webinars, if you don't have time to read the books, we're all very busy, at least try to read the foreword, because she captures a lot of this idea of the roots to where racism stemmed, the whole discussions around colonialism and imperialism, and discussions that we should be having with our students as well. So really important for us to have the training. You will have seen, I thought I had to put in a slide around critical race theory, because you will have seen the comments from the Equalities Minister in Parliament around teachers who use critical race theory or talk about white privilege and so on. We will be breaking the law. But I wasn't surprised to see that comment coming through, particularly because Donald Trump crossed the waters, had made that comment just in September there, I think. So we were following suit. And for me, critical race theory is the theoretical perspective that underpins all of my research, all the work that I do. It informs my practice with my student teachers and early years practitioners, because essentially it's around the critical aspect of social justice. It's about putting racism at the centre of our discussions when we're looking at race inequality, and what it's actually telling us that it's sometimes manifests in those very subtle and covert ways. And for me, that authoritarianism that is being shown by saying we don't discuss critical race theory is in effect, again, the government's view of silencing academics and silencing anybody who's having those conversations around inequality. I believe Bruna shared with me that you've already had a session on microaggression, so I'm not going to move on to that. I'll not talk about this in any detail, but really, again, it's back to that racial literacy then, perhaps, I want to maybe state here that it's so important that colleagues are racially literate, so that they feel confident in having conversations. They're confident in identifying when someone has made a slight or an insult or a slur, that whether it was intentional or unintentional, or even just for us to check in with ourselves, because we all might inadvertently make a comment sometimes that would be derogatory in nature and not give it a second thought. So be comfortable with the literature. We need to have the language with which to name racism, to begin to frame it, because only then can we begin to change our practice. We would have the lens, the right lens to begin to think about whether our policies, our practices, our curriculum, our professional services are fit for purpose, and where are the gaps, what do we need to address. Observations that Professor Rowena Arshad made in one of our previous webinars, I'm just going to be sharing them with you here as well, that what we worked with and the premise for our group was the absolute need for senior leadership buy-in. And if I can maybe perhaps show you a kind of vision in my head, we had in our steering group the thought that we would have senior level buy-in, sector buy-in, we'd have our grassroots here, and then we would be working together to come towards this middle point. And it's the middle management also that is known as the sort of middle stuckness sometimes, where things perhaps are coming from our leaders, they're coming from grassroots levels, but something happens here in the middle that things don't move forward. So that repeated senior leadership is crucial in taking this work forward. And we were so overwhelmed with our endorsement in August. So all 19 universities and 26 colleges in Scotland signed up to our declaration. And the declaration was quite simply, racism exists on our campuses and in society, call it what it is, reject it in all its forms, and we stand united against it. And to get our vice principals to sign up to a declaration that was absolutely phenomenal. But the hard work starts, that's the beginning of the journey. And so this is where we need that repeated buy-in. and where our senior leaders are confident to talk about race equality. And one of the questions I faced from one of our vice principals learning and teaching committee meetings that I addressed was, how do we get our senior leaders to become confident here? And I'll come back to that idea of training, but not a one-off training session, not an unconscious bias training session, because quite often for me, unconscious bias training is a get-out clause. And often actually the ones I have been at or attended have actually ended up reinforcing negative stereotypes inadvertently. And so I'm very cautious of that. I'm very critical of it. So we need to be very mindful of training that really calls it what it is and actually addresses the issues. We also need to have people who are leading the initiatives, ideally obviously to have seniority at an institutional level, because oftentimes we know what it works in our institutions. We need to have that, that leadership in order for someone to say, right, this is really important, and we need to take that conversation forward. The action to be informed by our Black and minority ethnic students and staff and our informed allies. These are our colleagues who are with us on that journey and who have developed that nuanced understanding of race and racism. But it's so important, folks, that we listen to our BME students, because oftentimes when I look at the sort of university student evaluations for Scotland, certainly, our students are telling us that they can't connect with their staff. Sometimes they feel there's a disconnect because they don't understand their lived experiences. And so therefore, they feel that sense of belonging often is not there for them. So when we listen to their lived experiences, and one of the things about critical race theory is the counter narratives, is, you know, walking into the shoes of your BME colleagues and BME students to know and understand their lived experiences goes a long way. And we need to start capturing data, folks. And I know that even in Scotland here, it's really problematic when we look for data, how many of our students from a BME background, and we know that there's also those barriers, because oftentimes I'll get, but Khadija, it's not my fault. I mean, if people don't disclose that information, how are we meant to know? And so yes, absolutely that barrier is there, but how do we get better at using more evidence-based to inform the work that we're doing? And so for me, it really does come down to this notion, and this is my primary teacher hat on again, you know, if we as educators, as practitioners, can begin to just deconstruct, you know, our own ethnic identity, or for our white colleagues, our own whiteness, we're in a far better position. We have a perspective advantage then to begin to think about why perhaps our current programmes, our curriculum, our processes perhaps might not work for some of our young people in society. And, you know, it's really difficult, folks. Nado Aveling is a fantastic white academic in the States, and I've read a lot of her work, and she says that when we ask our fellow white colleagues to interrogate their own racialized, you know, positioning, and I've put here gendered and class-based positioning, because every time I talk about privilege and whiteness, somebody will say to me, Khadija, what about the white working class? They're certainly not privileged. So it's always those counter arguments that come to the fore. So it's a very difficult thing to do. And she calls it hacking at our very roots. So any conversation around race and racism invokes a sense of uncomfortableness. And I've said this many times, folks, it's so important that we do create those safe spaces where you are invited to lean into that discomfort. And you lean into the discomfort, you have some training, you have some literature to read, you're having conversations with your colleagues and your peers, and you move beyond that discomfort, beyond that defensiveness or guilt, and to a conversation where you are examining how whiteness functions. Whiteness as a social construct, that whiteness that informs our beliefs, our policies, our practices, and the systemic nature of whiteness, to then you developing that walking the talk, developing that anti-racist consciousness through listening to the counter narratives. So again, I'll comment on BAME representation here, that where we have BME representation in our committees, in our staff groups, and BAME representation in leadership roles also, that those counter narratives really come to life, and it helps us to begin to understand what perhaps might not be working. So it's really important. And for me, it really is that notion of, you know, we need to name it, as our endorsement says, our declaration. We base it on and validate the perspectives of our BME students. And oftentimes, you know, microaggressions, micro-invalidations, you know, I've often had somebody say to me, you know, they've not met me before, and they'll say, my goodness, you articulate yourself well, you know, and why is that assumption being made because I'm a woman of colour and I wear a hijab, that you feel that perhaps I can't articulate myself, so you're making questions or assumptions about my competency. But these are just those everyday microaggressions that sometimes manifest, that as a BME colleague in academia, I deal with on a regular basis, whether I'm doing race equality training for external providers or just navigating my own personal space in my own community where I live. So it's about taking that action, folks, and it's that actionable change that we can only achieve through allyship. And when we talk about allyship, you know, what do we mean? And you know, Daryl Dwing Sue's work is fascinating here, so I've included the reference there for you. And there's another fantastic book, actually, and this is not a Blue Peter, here's one I've made earlier, but it's because it's on my desk, I was looking at it, and it's Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. Fantastic book for colleagues to engage in, because really talking about what does that allyship look like, how do we move forward from the, you know, defensiveness or let's change the subject, I'm feeling uncomfortable, but actually getting individuals who belong to those dominant social groups to begin to think about how we can impact change together. And in that regard, you know, that moving away from awareness to allyship, so it goes further than the understanding of racism. It's then saying, right, now I understand, I actually see that I have this level of privilege. I'm actually going to use my privilege to be able to develop these conversations around my practice. So I'm now not going to say it's good enough to say I'm not racist. I'm actually going to have to say I'm an anti-racist practitioner. And so being prepared, exactly that, it's that paradigm shift. And I'll share with you Gurnam Singh's model with you later. And that's what we used in our last webinar. Actually, we just took each of the columns and spoke to each other about what stood out for us, and then introduced that trajectory from the sort of white supremacy, moving through to the awareness, the understanding, through to allyship. So it's a mind shift. It's an absolute mind shift here about how are we going to begin to use that in terms of our allyship. Centering the voices and experiences of those who are marginalised. It's really important, folks, because that's where we get that the true narratives, and that helps us to begin to question our practice. Certainly from my own experience, I've had colleagues, I think the advice I give to colleagues actually is that start to speak to colleagues who are from diverse cultural backgrounds, start to hear those narratives, because it really does add a different perspective to your work, and allows you to see things from a different lens, and that's really important. But the other aspect here is we need to move from this, you know, the individual actions. They're important in themselves, but for sustained change, for that sustained shared thinking, we need to have everybody on board. So the systems approach, where we really are thinking about what's happening here, what part of our systems reproduce racism, and those institutional structures that marginalise our BME students and colleagues. So that's really important, folks. And maybe a point to mention here is about if you are a BME colleague and you become that go-to person, there's a level of burden there as well. So that burden of representation. So it's not about your BME colleagues taking this work forward, because they have the lived experience. It's about your colleagues, your white colleagues also working with you to take that forward. So it's a collective approach. Requires building anti-racist stamina. Of course, we need to sustain the dialogue, the debate, but also be very mindful that many times we'll be faced with the barriers and the kind of very much what can we do scenario. This is what works, why change what works commentary also sometimes that we get, the pushback that we might get from particular colleagues. And we also need to be very mindful, folks, that sometimes our BME staff work quietly behind the scenes. And how do we centre and show acknowledgement and recognise the efforts that they put in to their institution to further this cause and to continue that discussion around race equality, because oftentimes you'll find they may be doing it in their own lecture theatres, within their own programmes of study, or perhaps maybe there's the other part to that where they're not doing it for fear of the implications. Now that's another aspect there, and my argument there would be we need to create safe and safe spaces for BME colleagues to feel comfortable in being who they are and being able to address issues that are important and related to their lived experience, so that they are comfortable and not having to assimilate into a majority culture, which oftentimes, I know when I started in the academy, I did that. I wasn't speaking about race equality, although I was really wanting to do it, but I was worried about what my colleagues might think or what the students might say, and the fear of implications in terms of my own career trajectory. And I think when you get to a certain stage, and obviously my research really helped to inform, and I built the resilience and capacity, and in my institution, recognising that effort really helped to support my work in this area as well. And so, folks, I mean, just to very quickly, because I'd really want to sort of stop for kind of opportunities for Q&A, because that's really important. This was our declaration, which all our universities and colleges have signed up to, and we were really overwhelmed, and it's been fantastic, but the hard work starts now. And that's because what we've been doing with our colleagues is using Gurnam Singh's model here to say, right, where do you see yourselves across this trajectory? And we started off, I know that kind of you were at the last webinar, we didn't have the headings there for white supremacy, white indifference, and we just started to talk about the bullet points. And eventually we introduced the headings, and it was really interesting to see how the conversation unfolded. And what we're really wanting to get to also is obviously the white allyship. And many of us are at that area where we've got the white awareness, but let's not be fooled, folks. Let's absolutely not be complacent. We are not in a post-racial era, and we still have many of our systems, our practices, and sometimes our colleagues who are very much in that very first column. And we need to be thinking about how we move forward from that. So to support the declaration, what we did have was we've now put together a framework, and we're calling it a statement of intent. It's our race statement. And as you can see, there are 8 broad headlines there. And what we'll be doing is we'll be providing them with more detailed information under each of those headlines, but with a view that every institution will tailor that to suit theirs, because every institution is different. Every institution sits within a community, and how you interact within that community will be slightly different. So modifications and flexibility absolutely required. So going from fostering an anti-racist culture of understanding, so that's my point about training of all staff, our most senior level staff. It has to start from there, and it's not your one-off training or your unconscious bias training. It's sustained training for white senior leaders around racism, and moving on to looking at allyship. Supporting an anti-racist curriculum. Now, you will have heard of the term decolonising the curriculum. There's been lots of calls to decolonise our curriculums, and then some of the questions I took from our learning and teaching committees in Scotland was, so Khadija, does that mean we have to start again? Absolutely not. It's about saying, let's look at what we have already. I'm a programme leader for 4 undergraduate early years programmes. In my place, couldn't possibly start all over again, It's about looking at what we have and thinking about what are we prioritizing, what voices are missing, what different perspectives are not being encouraged here or even problematized or considered. But more importantly, what agency do we offer to our students? Do our students have an element of co-production? And how do we manage that co-production? And that's really getting to know our students, getting to know their lived experiences, and begin to think about how we can encourage them to bring, perhaps even raise those gaps that we have presented to them and have those discussions. So that co-production, that shared agency in developing our curriculum is really key in moving forward, as well as the whole aspect of the decoloniality and looking at the roots of where we have arrived at the moment. So think about that. We did want to call it, we thought about, we troubled ourselves a lot on, should we call it decolonising the curriculum and should we call it anti-racist curriculum? And I thought it was much broader to put it under anti-racist curriculum, because decolonising, absolutely, but there's also that aspect of the critical edge of looking at those inequalities and questioning how they manifest within our day-to-day work. We also wanted to look at our systematic practices, and that was along the routes of reporting and supporting mechanisms. Oftentimes we look at our governance structures as well. So who's on Senate? I know in Scotland we have Senate within university senior executive committees, vice, principal committees. Do we have diverse leadership there? And if not, how do we capture those diverse voices to inform the policies and the practices that are being set at that senior level? So that investing in a diverse workforce. And folks, the question I was asked earlier this morning was about tokenism, and that sometimes we'll have universities that will say, yes, we have BME staff putting in applications for jobs, but sadly they didn't get shortlisted to the job, the role. We have to ask ourselves why, and was the interview panel diverse? And those things are important as well. But the recording and responding effectively to racist incidents, that's a huge one, absolute huge one. How are our BME students and staff alike confident in the process that we have in our institutions? Do they feel confident that if they were to report a racist incident, that the person who's recording that has a nuanced understanding of racism and how it manifests? What will happen once that's been reported? What will be the action taken? That needs to be much more transparent. How are we dealing with that? What is the implications of somebody reporting to then change happening within the organisation? And we've looked at gender-based violence. We're looking at some good practice that's already there. But again, we don't want that. Oftentimes when we look at all the protected characteristics, race falls off the agenda. And so we're foregrounding that and we're putting that in the centre. How are we doing that appropriately and effectively? And what are the implications if it's not? Again, data is huge. We need to start capturing that data. But the other aspect here was for us to consult with our community partners. As I said before, universities don't sit alone. We're sitting within communities. Reach out to community hubs where perhaps there are BME community hubs that we can learn from and we can partner with in terms of our work at the university. But for us folks, point 8 there, the responsibility and accountability was so key for us. Who is going to take responsibility for that? Is it going to be our senior managers? Is it going to be the vice principal? And who will be held to account? What does that accountability look like within our institutions? How are we going to check in with how we're doing with the whole anti-racist agenda within our institutions? And just very quickly before I stop speaking, these are the sorts of, we're calling them assets that we're going to be providing to our Scottish institutions. So, race statement, guidance on reporting, we've linked it to the Scottish Code of Good Higher Education Governance. We're developing an anti-racist ally stamp. We've got a microaggressions living document. We've got a racial literacy glossary. Lots of things that we're working on a video campaign at the moment. Our webinars, if some of you haven't been part of the webinars, there's links to them, and they are really, I would like to think, engaging, and there's lots to learn and unlearn from there. Some of our steering group have written blogs, so please do go on to the Advanced HE website and visit that. But these are some of the assets that we will be producing in our project. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and perhaps just open the floor to any comments or questions. And I don't know, I'm quite comfortable with somebody either speaking out, Corinna, or if you want a structured, more, better way, then I'm over to you.
Okay, thank you, Khadija. That was great, and I can only echo what Khadija just said about the Advanced HE webinars. They are absolutely fantastic. So definitely go and sign up if you're not already signed up to them already. So we've got a couple of questions just scrolling through the chat. I don't know whether people would like. The first one was from Jason. And if you were there, Jason, I don't know whether you would like to ask Khadija your question, or whether you would like me to do it for you. You'll need to unmute yourself if you did want to.
I'm happy for you to ask it, Corinna.
Okay, no problem. So the question, Khadija, is recognizing racism validating race as a meaningful concept and thus perpetuating racism?
Well, yeah, very interesting question, Jason. Thank you. So for me, absolutely, we need to. I would say we need to acknowledge it, and we need to develop a really firm understanding of how it manifests, the roots to, because when we talk about racism, there's a lot of questions around power and privilege within that. And I think oftentimes I have worked with colleagues who, should I say, shy away from those conversations. And what they say to me then is, Khadija, I don't want to engage in this because I feel as if the whole sort of, perpetuating the discourse, I want to avoid that, and I'm feeling really uncomfortable, particularly when I open the conversation to whiteness as a social construct. And sometimes my colleagues, I have to say to them, look, I'm not saying it to you as an individual, it is about that social construct, that ideological paradigm that we're referring to here, to unpack. So I don't know, Jason, if I'm going in a roundabout way, but I think what I'm saying is I would absolutely acknowledge that we need to have those discussions, open, honest, frank conversations around it. And if we do fall into that area where folk think it's more of a sort of perpetuating in nature, then we need to have those discussions as to why.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a question from Pamela. Again, Pamela, if you want to, don't know if you want to ask Khadija your question yourself. It's something that Khadija, you touched on earlier.
Yeah, sure. I'm from the English department at Sussex, and it's Pam actually, but I can't get rid of the Pamela there. It's really the question about how do we fight back against the burden aspect for BAME colleagues, but which always seems to be this problem of, like, you want to consult with people, and yet making them into the experts turns into making them do all the work. And if you had like practical advice, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. That's a really, really good question to ask, because certainly I've been on the other side of that, where I have been the go-to colleague, and then suddenly you feel, so my experience has been where colleagues have asked me, particularly now within teacher education in our institution, I've been doing all the inputs on race equality. What I have said to my colleagues is now, why don't you come in? Why don't you sit in the lecture theatre with our students? So the first instance, that's what they did, and thereafter we planned together. So we planned the lesson, we team taught it really effectively. And that's the way forward, I would say. I don't mind colleagues coming to me and saying, Khadija, I'm not so sure, I just wanted to run this past you. That's absolutely fine. The doing of it is perhaps then where you would say, but how could we do this together? Or could you point me in the right direction to some literature that would help me develop my own understanding of it? And so therefore I can go away and plan something, but I'd be quite happy to run it past you just to see if you think that I've got the tone correct, or, you know, because sometimes that can be a worry that we do have. But I think it's really about saying, let's do it together. Let's look at it as a staff in the English department, say, Pam, and look at your curriculum and say, actually, where are some of those gaps? How can we, in English, is a fantastic opportunity to look at decolonising the curriculum by looking at even the text that we set our students to read. You know, what's the ideology behind that, the author, what's the tone of that author's voice? Because sometimes the books that I've read in secondary school were very racist in nature, but I wasn't able to identify it at the time. And so therefore, as a staff, we look at it together. And if you have BME staff representation, they're brilliant because you'll have that perspective. But Pam, also be mindful though that you may have BME colleagues who might not think that they're in a position to actually support you because they themselves have spent most of their career trying to fit in and almost kind of dismiss that aspect of their identity, because if they've been raised in, you know, in the UK, their schooling will have been one of assimilation. And so therefore, even because I developed a leadership and mentoring program for BAME professionals, and in that we work on affirmative action, we work on, you know, that sort of added value, that the skill sets that they have that have perhaps been dormant or not been recognized for so long, that bringing them to the fore to bring that cognitive diversity out. So there's a kind of balance there as well to be drawn.
Is that okay, Pam? Answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you. So just moving on, we have a question from Jim, which is, how do we find good anti-racist training that is really effective? Do we come to you, Khadija, and ask you to come and do some training?
Good anti-racist training, gosh, I would maybe say to you, there's a lot, you know, I mean, obviously, given the last 6 months, we've all been in lockdown, and COVID pandemic and the statistics coming through from that, plus the George Floyd incident and the resurgence of Black lives, everybody seems to be offering anti-racist training, don't they? You know, so suddenly everyone's become an expert. And I mean, I'm not saying that, I'm not being critical, but I'm just saying, I think you have to be very careful yourself. So who's deciding, which organisation are you looking at? Look at the makeup of that organisation, ask to see an overview of the training pack, and be mindful that the lens with which you apply to look at it is, in itself, is it more of a, I'm worried about white saviour approach? I don't know if some of you have come across that terminology. So just be mindful that it's not about how do we help, you know, BME colleagues, so that kind of, you know, there's a deficit and I can help to do or move the conversation forward. So it's not about that. It's really about asking you to interrogate your own understanding, using that then to problematize our policies, our whatever goes on in our institutions, to then moving towards developing a really strong racial literacy, to then questioning your sense of agency. What power do you have within your own immediate department or program for you to make change? To then thinking about the agency of your students, to then moving into that real looking at allyship and how do we sustain those conversations. I mean, I have a charity that I run as a side thing, and I've developed a program for white senior leaders, which we're delivering at the moment to some of our colleges in Scotland. And it's been developed by BAME leaders within Scotland. So I'm absolutely confident, and certain feedback we've had is really good. So I would be saying to you, reach out to BAME organisations and see what they have to offer, because they will certainly bring that lived experience, and it will not be from a white saviour approach. I have had many colleagues reach out to organisations where the training is being delivered, and it's very much here's a problem that we need to sort, and it's coming from a deficit approach rather than saying actually the diversity that BAME representation brings to our institutions is fabulous, and we're losing out. There are missed opportunities not by having BAME representation in our places. So training that forces us to be critical, I think. Think critical, read critical.
That's great.
I don't know if that answers your question, Jim, but certainly just develop a critical eye as to which institutions you approach.
That's fantastic and makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So we have someone else wanting to ask a question, and I apologize in advance because I'm sure I'm just about to mispronounce your name. It's Kingju. Did you want to ask your question?
Oh, yes, Karina, thank you very much. Shukran, Dr. Mohammed. Wonderful talk. I got some training on racial discrimination issues. Just like a quick comment, I would like to listen to you more. So in your book or in your talk, whether you tell the difference between vertical racial discrimination and horizontal, we may not use the conceptual approaches regarding horizontal and vertical. I think probably it could make good sense. Normally speaking, people care more about vertical racial discrimination because like they could be your line manager, they could be your like supervisor, it could be your director. But like many people, we are too busy and to care really about like horizontal racial discrimination. It's a really, really difficult question. So the first comment is vertical and horizontal. Then very quickly, I really appreciate your number 8, the item you mentioned, how to address such a racial discrimination issue. It's about responsibility and accountability. So normally speaking, we say from law, there's different legal entity. For instance, university on the one hand, like a department school on the other hand, like we individuals as a different legal entity. And I just think we are really short of individual accountability or individual responsibility. Any issues come up, people said, where the problem happened? Oh, University of Sussex, or which department or which school. But it always like in vain because we do not hold those individuals accountable or responsible for their behavior or liable for their behavior. Otherwise, everything like we got numerous like institutes or like organization, I can say it's window dressing. I'm sorry to say it this way, it's window dressing because we cannot hold those individuals and like accountable or liable or responsible for their behavior. So I cut it short. That's my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I had difficulty hearing at some points, but I think I'll try to answer what I've picked up on. Okay. So your question around the sort of horizontal, vertical, absolutely, in a sense of, you know, when I'm thinking about, I'll give myself as an example. So I'm in middle management at the moment. I'm a program leader. I'm also a line manager for a number of colleagues within my school. And when we think about BME colleagues and perhaps any discrimination that they may face or the implications in terms of promotion or retention, there is a sense of that, yes, you need to have your colleagues all, I suppose, on the same page where they're supporting BME colleagues and recognizing. I have an issue with performance development reviews. You know, oftentimes with your line manager, you're talking about your contribution and what you've achieved in the last year and what you're planning to do in your next academic year. And my argument has been, if my line manager doesn't truly understand the added value and the lived experience that I bring to my work, my day-to-day work, then there's a gap there in them identifying my potential and where I can perhaps add value to and increase, you know, any work within race equality or whatever. So there's a real need for our line managers to be trained. So this is why I'm saying training at every level is important, to recognise how we can check in with ourselves about any kind of implicit bias that we may hold. Yeah. And because sometimes that implicit bias comes to the fore and people don't realise it, or the assumptions that we may make about particular communities might feature within that. So for me, anything to do with the sort of the vertical, the horizontal, and even as when I wasn't in line management, I was working with my fellow colleagues, my peers in the academy, I didn't personally experience anything in terms of what I would call discrimination. At times, I just felt that sometimes I would want to say something around that I would think that would add to the discussion, and I may have been a little bit reluctant for maybe perhaps concerned what my colleagues may think. But then when I opened that conversation to say, actually, there is something I'd like to contribute, and I'd like you to listen to what I have to say, and then we can have a discussion about what you think. And it's finding the confidence, the resilience to be able to speak. And that's when we create, so I think it's the relationships that are formed within teams, and how do we create that ethos within our program teams where everybody feels comfortable to bring their whole self into the academy. So whether you have a BME member of staff who's not wanting to say that I leave my personal identity and my cultural experiences at the university door, and I come in here to teach a subject, because we know that from looking at identity theory that the two are intimately linked. So it's about getting your colleagues to have cognizance of that. So rather, I think maybe the long of the short, what I'm trying to say is, I acknowledge the difference within a staff team, nurture that difference, and begin to celebrate it. And then we begin to see how we can impact the curriculum, what our students are learning, what we're providing for them as resources, because we're coming together to share that lived experience. In the sense of the wider committees, I would say that how do we do it from a senior level? If you look at a top-down approach, so your vertical, horizontal, thinking about the makeup of your committee. So every university has an equality, diversity and inclusion committee, or it's named something similar. Look at the representation. Who's got a seat round the table, right? Are they predominantly female, white, or are they predominantly male, white? Do we have some ethnic diversity there, some linguistic diversity there to inform the different perspectives? And that also has an impact, because whoever sits in our committees, whoever chairs those committees, has a level of power and privilege, and how the message that's discussed there is then filtered through to individual departments and line managers, and how that then impacts on those one-to-one interactions. I don't know if that's answered your question. I was missing parts of it because it wasn't very clear, so I hope that's okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just keeping an eye on time. We've just gone over. There was just one more question, Khadija, if you're happy to answer, which was from Emily. And it was about pronouncing names. So Emily says she gets really worried about reading non-white names or names that are new to her, and worries about pronouncing them wrong and making someone feel other, and particularly as she has dyspraxia. Do you have a best way of approaching this, and should I do anything other than apologize? That's what Emily says.
Absolutely, Emily, and what a fantastic question to end with. And again, that's showing some real sort of I suppose responsibility on your part. I would absolutely say what I would say to any teacher working with a young child, and I would say the same applies to a student or of any age, is ask. It's just simply, I used to be always that child, when the teacher comes to that point in the register where they begin to struggle or they stutter or they start to go, and you go, that'll be me. And so speak to the student either beforehand and find out and say, I'm really sorry. And in fact, I've always learned to say, be apologetic. And I'm saying, well, actually, you don't need to be. Just say, I really want to get your name correct, because for me, it's simply a matter of respect. Can you help me? How do I pronounce your name? And don't be shy to ask. Don't be afraid to ask, because I actually think that the person that you will ask will be really pleased that you've actually taken the time and effort to even give that consideration, and that you've understood that it's important for you to get that individual's name correct. So ask, and if you forget, you ask again. And it's kind of what I would do in a school, was silly me, I need to get this right. It's my responsibility. I need you to support me. So every time I pronounce this incorrectly, can you correct me, please? So I think that's my best advice. I think I would give you my personal advice I use as well, because there's many names that I wouldn't be able to pronounce either. And I think it's just simply asking.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Emily's thanked you as well in the chat. And I think that is us for the session. Thank you so much, Khadija. Like I've already said, I've seen Khadija now at a few of the Advanced HE webinars, which I can't recommend highly enough. They're really engaging and really interesting and educative, and it's a joy. They're a joy to be part of. There's so many different people who are taking part, and some really great discussions that come out of those. So I just want to say thank you again for giving us your time, and hopefully we will be able to follow in your footsteps and put some of your actions into place in our university as well.
Oh, thank you, Corinne. It's been a pleasure, honestly. Thank you so much for all your questions. And yes, and I'm sure you'll, just by being part of the session, shows that you have an interest and that you are on your way to developing that allyship. So it's wonderful to see that. And Corinne, you can reach out to me anytime you need for any signposting or whatever. I'll do my best.
You're fantastic. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Great compliments. Thank you, Khadija.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for your time.